to the Pakistan user group for the invitation to speak today. As was mentioned, we're going to be discussing D365F user licensing today. I guess a quick introduction about myself. Again, my name's Alex Meyer. I work for a company called FastPath. We do security audit and compliance reporting across a number of different ERP and CRM systems. With that comes the ability for us to have in-depth knowledge of the entire licensing model as well. My contact information is there in the middle. If you'd like to reach out to me or look at one of my blogs that I have, or security class, or the podcast that I just started with a colleague of mine. I have a background in Microsoft MVP and business apps, and I've done a number of these sessions before, both in person and virtually as well. So make sure I can pull up the chat here. If you have questions throughout this, feel free to put them in the chat. Happy to answer those as well. So a quick agenda for today. What we're going to look at, one is we're going to be looking at the F&O security model. So looking at how security is actually done within F&O itself. We're then going to look at how licensing is tied to security, right? So why those two, or how those two are intertwined and connected. We're going to look at the two different licensing mechanisms that are available within F&O, both the entry point based licensing and privilege based licensing. We're going to do a really quick overall demo from a look at the reporting that's available, as well as a real life example of how you would actually go about trying to find areas where maybe you could change your security a little bit in the system to impact your licensing. And of course, we'll have questions here at the end, and you can again put your questions throughout the session in the chat as well. I'll be happy to answer those. So first and foremost, looking at the F&O security model, just a high-level overview. D365 follows F&O follows the AX 2012 security model, and that it's a role-based security model, right? So users are assigned to roles in the system, and those roles actually give the user access to be able to perform actions in the system, right? It's a pessimistic security model, which means that a user has no access in the system until you grant it. And then there are different security layers in the system that make up what a user has access to, and then those security layers underneath them have securable objects that actually are the objects that allow you to perform actions in the system. So these security layers are just groupings of different objects in the system. So you have roles, duties, and privileges. And if you've attended one of my sessions or looked at the security model within AX or F&O, you've probably seen a visual similar to what you're seeing on the right there, where you have roles at the top, you have duties underneath those roles, you have privileges underneath the duties, and then you have objects underneath those, right? So in a perfect world, that's how that hierarchy would work. And then those securable objects are broken into a couple different options or categories as well. You have menu items, which are tied to, or there's a couple different types of menu items, and we'll get to those as well. Tables, data needs, and service operations, right? So those are actually the objects that allow you to perform actions in the system. And then your security layers on top of those are just groupings of those objects in different ways. So if we take a deeper dive into those security layers again are broken down into the roles, duties, and privileges. Starting at the top, you have your roles. These are what can be assigned to users, right? So these are your broadest security layers. They're going to represent things like a job function that a user would perform, things like an accountant or account payable, right? Those are all examples of roles. And then they can be made up of any number of sub roles, and then duties and privileges are assigned to those as well, right? So you can assign roles to other roles, you can assign duties to roles or privileges to roles, right? So they're kind of a very large grouping of objects that can be assigned to the role object or role security layer. Underneath your role, you have your duties. This represents that middle security layer that we were looking at. It's going to be more focused than your role. It's going to be a general task the user will perform, things like approving customer invoices, maintaining budget plans, things like that. And then the only thing that can be assigned to duties is privileges, right? So you can't assign duties to other duties or anything like that. So the only thing that can be assigned to duties is privileges. And then at the privilege level, right, this is your most granular security layer. And this is also where your object assignment occurs, right? So your security objects are actually going to be assigned to privileges, and then they flow up through the duties and roles that you have. This is going to represent a very specific process that a user would perform. Things like adding a bomb line, adding a customer, things like that. Right. So those are the three different security layers. And then underneath the privilege, right, we have our secureable objects. So if we take a closer look at the secureable object options we have in the system, right, we have our menu items. So your menu items are going to be broken into three subcategories underneath those. The first being menu item displays, and these are going to link to forms that you have within F&O. So anytime a user goes to a page in the user interface, right, that security to that page, the page itself is controlled by the access that the user has to the menu item display tied to that form in the UI. So that's what the menu item display is tied to. Menu item outputs are any time that a user is running a report in the system, and you can export that report, right? So if you click a button and it runs a report and you can export it, in most cases that's going to be a menu item output. And then the final type is a menu item action. So anytime you're in the system, you click a button and some action is performed behind the scenes, whether that's things like posting a purchase order or journal entry, cutting a check, right? Anytime there's something that that a process is being performed when you click a button, that's a menu item action. The next secureable object type is called tables. These actually refer to SQL tables. So when you're granting access to table objects within F&O, you're in essence granting access to the SQL tables underneath, right? So if you're granting read, update, create, or delete, or the denying permission to those, right, you're denying and granting access to those SQL tables through the application. The next secureable object type is data entities. So data entities are a newer concept within F&O, but they are a way to combine different business processes to into one resource that you can interact with. So behind the scenes, AX and F&O have a lot of what's called database normalization. So one business process can actually span multiple SQL tables behind the scenes. And so instead of having to interact with all those individual tables, you have what's called data entities that Andre was going through in the last session that will span across those different tables and give you one entity that you can actually do business processes on, right? So you can do create, read, update, delete processes on those. And these will cover things. I mean, there's thousands of these now out of the box, and you can create your own, but things like purchase orders and users and things like that, you can interact with one data entity externally and not have to go to each individual table underneath those business processes. These data entities don't require any X++ knowledge to create, although if you're going to create them, you do have to go within Visual Studio to create them, but you don't have to actually write any X++ for those. And then the final piece is service operations. These are an externally facing API that you can actually hit from external services, right? So if you want to have some service and have an API call into F&O, that would be a service operation. And obviously these do require X++ knowledge to create. And one other piece of this is that the security for that does not follow the normal create, read, update, and delete that other objects in the system do. You have the invoke option, which is either you have access to it or you don't. And so that invoke is specifically for service operations. All right, so the question as we go through all of this is, why are we reviewing the F&O security model, right? So why go through all of that if we're going to be talking about licensing today? And the main piece for this, and the one thing, the major point of this entire presentation is that your security is going to be tied directly to licensing, right? So what a user is assigned in the system will directly impact the licensing required for that user. So this is different than a lot of other systems in the biz app space, right? A lot of other systems, your licensing either drives what that user can do, or the licensing is derived from the consumption or utilization of the actual application. And that's not the case within F&O. So it's kind of unique in this space where the security that the user is assigned is going to directly impact the licensing that user has to be is required to have. And so it's not about the utilization or what the user is actually using in the system, it's what they're assigned. And so that leads to instances where a user could very well be over provisioned from a security perspective, right, requiring a higher license than they may be required to have. And unless the user is going in, the business or the customer, right, is going in and actually reviewing the access the user has or reviewing the license requirements, right, there's not a good way from a Microsoft perspective to say, oh, this user could require a lower license. We're going to go in and make that security change. So this is something that is kind of put onto the end user to maintain as far as what license requirements they are supposed to have. So if we look at the licensing model within F&O, there's a couple different options here. So I'm going to first show the original licensing that occurred within F&O, right, with all the way up until October 2019, and then we'll look at the new licensing model. So if you purchased prior to October 2019, you probably had something like this available to you when you went to buy your licenses from either Microsoft or your partner or whoever. You had the ability to go in and actually buy what was called the Dynamics 365 plan, which actually gave you access to the CE side as well as the F&O side. Or you could actually buy a customer engagement plan, which gave you access to all of the customer engagement side. You could buy a unified ops plan, which gave you access to F&O and that side of things. And then you had your team member and activity licenses underneath this as well, right? So you had the ability to go down to those levels, right, if you didn't require the full license. But you had this option of either, buying everything from a CE and F&O side. You could buy all the CE side, you could buy all the F&O side, right? So you had these different options in that regard. After 2019, Microsoft decided that they were going to switch this up a little bit and make this more modularized, where you had all these different options before you could buy a single license to span across CE and F&O, or buy a single license to give you all of CE or all of F&O. Now you had to go in and actually choose which modules you wanted to license a user for, right? So instead of, if we take the F&O side, right, this is broken out into finance, supply chain management, retail, talent, right, along with some other licenses as well, right? But you had to go in and actually say this user was going to be a finance user or a supply chain management user, right? You couldn't just say they were an F&O user, right? So obviously this is a little bit more granular than the initial licenses options that were available, and so there's a little bit of a change to how that licensing is actually done, and we'll get into the specifics of how Microsoft determines these licenses here in just a minute. But looking at this, right, the question then becomes, okay, well, what happens if I have a user that needs a finance and a supply chain management license, right? What if they go across multiple, or what if they're on the customer engagement side and they need a sales and a field service, right, or whatever combination of licenses you have? And so that's where Microsoft came up with the idea of having a base license and an attached license. So if we look at the next slide here, this is where Microsoft has basically said, here are the valid combinations of licenses that you can have from a base and an attached scenario, right? So if you have a base license of finance, let's say, right, you could have a add-on or an attached license of almost anything, right, from sales enterprise, SCM, field service, right? You can attach those other licenses to it. But if you had, for example, a guides license or a remote assist license, right, that can't be attached anywhere, right? That's a standalone license separate from anything else. And so the idea here is that your base license is going to cost more, right, and your attached licenses are going to cost less as you attach additional licenses to that user. So that's kind of the overall idea from this perspective. So now we have these two different licensing mechanisms in the system, right? How do we actually make them work together? And so when we're looking at this, those two mechanisms are really what I call entry point based licensing and privilege based licensing. So if we want to look at it from that perspective, your entry point based licensing is the licensing that we had with an AX 2012 if you were an AX user. But the idea is that Your entry point based licensing is going to be is a way to determine if a user requires an operations, activity, or team member license, right? So this is kind of giving you an overall category that the user should have access to. And then your privilege-based licensing actually breaks down that operations level into those the different license SKUs that we were just looking at. So things like finance, supply chain management, commerce, project operations, right? We're going to break that operations level down into those subcategories, if you will, based on the privilege-based licensing. And so then again, if that user requires multiple base licenses, the user would then have one base license and then attach the additional license that they require to have at a reduced price. But one thing to keep in mind here is that a user must have a base license before they can attach additional licenses to it. So now that we know the two different licensing mechanisms, right, why don't we go ahead and take a deeper dive into the two different mechanisms themselves and see how both of these react or how they act in the system. So if we go ahead and look at the entry point based licensing, right, this is going to be based on the access to entry points in the system. And when we say entry points, that's really meaning menu items. So when we're talking about menu item displays, outputs, and actions, right, those are what we consider to be entry points when we're referring to entry point based licensing. And so each entry point in this case has two separate parameters if you go and look at it in the AOT, right? So if you go into the AOT and pull up a menu item display, output, or action, right, one of the property or two of the properties on this on that object will be maintain user license and view user license. And so the idea is that if a user has read access to this particular object, then whatever license is in the view user license is going to be required for that user. If the user has create, update, or delete permission to that object, then whatever license is in the maintain user license is actually going to be required for that user, right? So entry point based licensing basically looks at all of the access this user has, looks at the menu items that user has, and then goes through and says, okay, this user has read access to this object that requires this license. This user has create access to this object that requires this license. And it goes through and looks at all of those different combinations. And then it looks to see, okay, what's the highest level license that this user is required to have. And it only takes one access at a higher license level for the user and role to require that higher level license. So if you have 1,000 accesses for this user and 999 of them are team member and one of them is operations, that user requires an operations level license, right? So it only requires that one access at a higher license level for the user to require that higher level license. So that's the entry point based licensing. If we jump over to the privilege based licensing, right, this is a little bit different. This is, again, this was added after October 2019. And the privilege based licensing is a way that Microsoft additionally added to break out that operations level license, right? Because they aren't allowing you to purchase operations level licenses anymore, right? So they needed a way to define how what this user actually need access to if they needed that operations level license. So the route that Microsoft took was to actually associate privileges to a specific object or specific license type in the system. And so these associations can actually be found in the licensing service plans privilege table. If you actually go in and look at the backend in SQL, you can actually see the association between the privilege and then the license SKU in the system. And then to add one more piece of, to add a little bit additional complexity to this, you'll notice that there's an is unique column over on the right-hand side there. The is unique column is a way for Microsoft to designate if that user is assigned to that particular privilege and the license tied to that privilege, if it's required to be assigned to the user, or if any number of base licenses or any number of licenses will satisfy that. So the way to look at this is if you have a set of privileges, and they're maybe you have a finance, a supply chain, and a retail, let's say, license, right? And they're all set to is unique of 0, right? That means that user only needs one of those 3 to be assigned to them, right? Because you're basically saying that this license assignment isn't unique to the user. So the user does need a base license, but it doesn't matter which one. Now, if we take that same scenario and we have the finance, supply chain, and retail, and they're all set to is unique of true, then that user is required to have all three, right? So then they need a base license of, let's say, finance, and then attaching the supply chain and retail, right, to that user, right? So it's a way for Microsoft to designate whether or not that license is required for that user, or if there's a set of licenses that will satisfy that license requirement, right? So again, that just adds a little bit additional layer of complexity there. So taking this a step further, right, after finding that table, I was curious about how this table is actually populated, right? That licensing service plans privilege table isn't populated immediately when on a brand new environment, right? If you deploy a new instance of F&O, that licensing service plans privilege table isn't populated. It's only populated after you execute the user license estimator report. So following that down and looking at the X++ code behind this, I actually found that that table is actually going to be populated by a static JSON file that's stored in a DLL behind the scenes. So if you actually go and look at this, Microsoft actually provides a JSON file or builds this DLL that's used, builds this JSON file into the DLL that's provided. And this JSON file is actually what stores the combinations of the privilege to the license, right? And so you're probably, as you're hearing this, you're probably thinking that there are some shortcomings in this, and there absolutely are, and we get to those in a future slide here where I talk about the gaps that exist. You can absolutely see that because this is a static file and it's not being determined dynamically, right? If you start adding new privileges or modifying privileges, right, you can see how this could cause an issue very quickly. But this is how it's currently set to populate that table, and that table then is used for the user license estimator report to actually generate the report that's given back to the user. So, and I apologize, this is slightly small. If you want a bigger version of this, the slide deck will be available, as well as this exact Visio diagram is on my blogs as well. But I created a Visio diagram, a waterfall decision tree here to actually show the steps or processes that are that you would have to go through to determine what user licensing is required for a particular user. So the first step in this is to determine if a user is assigned an object that is required to have an operations level license based on entry point based license methodology that we looked at earlier. If the user only has team member or activity license requirements, right, then we're done. We've determined that they either need an activity or team member license, and we don't have to go any further. So the only time you go to the next step is if that user does have an operations level license based on entry point based licensing. From there, then we have to determine if that object assignment is coming from a privilege that Microsoft has defined in that JSON file that we just looked at and is in the licensing service plans privilege table to require one or more of the new license SKUs. If this is a privilege that doesn't exist in that file or a custom privilege, right, and that user just requires, has an operations level license requirement based on entry point, but no associated privilege assigned to them is found, then that user just requires any base license, right? So it doesn't matter which one, as long as it's a base license assigned to that user, that's the requirement that will satisfy the requirements there. So the next step would be is if we do find a privilege associated to assigned to the user that does exist in that licensing service plans privilege table, then we need to determine if the privilege license assignment is set to the is unique of true, right? If it's not, then any license listed is unique of false for this user can be assigned to the user as a base license, right? And that user would then require just any of those base licenses that come from that process. If that is unique is set to true, then that license required for that license, whatever that license is required to be assigned to the user in either base or attached scenario, right? So obviously this is slightly complex, but these are the steps that you have to kind of go through to determine the end result for this particular user. So when we're looking at this, right, then the next question is, well, how can I actually report on this, and what steps can I actually take to start my process of analyzing both a role and a user perspective, right? What license requirement is there. So Microsoft has added some reporting around this. So for example, if you go into your system administration, your security configuration, and then look for any role, duty, or privilege in there, and then click on the view permissions report, you'll notice on the very right-hand side of this, you have the ability to see the license requirements for this. One key piece to this is that if you see the team member or activity license listed, right, that license is actually tied to the context or resource column here, right, because that's the entry point based licensing. If you see any of the new license SKUs, so for example, finance, SCM, retail, talent, right, any of those, right, then that's actually, that license entry is actually tied to the privilege, right? So that privilege is what is actually granting that license, not the object, right? So there's a little bit of you kind of have to know that that's where that ties to. Otherwise, you can be misled a little bit on what this actually is telling you. The final piece here is that you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, you'll always have the license requirements listed there. So you can see, for example, that this particular accountant role is requiring a finance license overall. So I know if I assign this accountant role to a user, that user is going to be required to have a finance license. Another report that Microsoft has is a licensing report in F&O. This can be found, or the user license counts report, sorry, can be found at the system administration counts path. This allows you to go in and actually pick it has some parameters that you can assign if you want to run it for a particular date and time. You can absolutely do that. And then this generates the report to the right. One thing to keep in mind is that this does require the batch job, and it's to be running, there's a licensing batch job, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head, that has to be running for this report to be populated. So if this report returns nothing, the first thing to check is that batch job is actually running on the system. But the report outputs in this case will show you the user, the roles that they're assigned, and again, we'll show you the entry point based licensing that's required based on the roles that are assigned to that user. Another report that we have is the security role effective access, which again is going to show you the entry point based licensing for a particular role. So this is kind of the same idea as like your system or the view permissions report we looked at earlier, except it's going to distill this down into basically saying this role is assigned to this object. So you're not going to get the intermediary pieces of the sub role duty and privilege. It's just going to show the role to object, and it's going to show you the license requirements for that. And then finally, the user license estimator report. It's the report that I was referencing earlier. This is located at the System Administration Inquiries License Reports and User License Estimator path. This is really the only report that will actually show you the user to new license association. And so you can go in and actually run this, and it'll show you based on the user requirement or the user that's provided, right here are the licenses that they're required to have. You'll notice that it just has those green bubbles filled to basically designate that user needs that particular license assigned. In earlier versions of F&O, there were some bugs in this report. For the most part, these are cleared up, but obviously there's still work to be done, I think, to get this report to be more useful. And we talk about that on the next slide here. But the current licenses as of 10.0.30 are finance, supply chain management, commerce, and project operations. So I mentioned a couple times about the gaps that exist within the user license estimator report. Obviously, because this is a static listing of a privilege to a license requirement, if you start modifying out of the box security, right, if you start adding or removing access or using things like the deny permission, that report is not going to take that into account. And so you could go in and, for example, create a privilege, or let me rephrase, you could take a privilege that currently requires, that's set to have a particular license, and actually add in additional objects to that that may, for example, if your privilege required a finance license, you could go in and add in, however many other secureable objects you wanted that actually would require additional licenses, and the report won't pick those up because it's already assigning the finance license. It doesn't know that you would need those additional licenses to it, right? So if you start adding or removing access, you can very easily start to make that report find the gaps in that report, and they would not be reporting correctly on the license requirements for that. It doesn't show, one of the biggest things about this report is that it doesn't show why a user requires a particular license. It just shows the license requirement. And so it's up to the user to actually do the additional steps to analyze why this user is requiring a particular license. If they want to actually, try to reduce that license, let's say, right, it doesn't give any of the information you would need to actually go through those. So it's a manual process for that. It doesn't show valid basin and attach options, right? So it just lists out the object or the licenses you're required to have. It doesn't show you the different options you have as far as, well, this license could be base and these could be attached, or this one could be base and these could be attached, right? So it doesn't show those options. And it doesn't give a great overview of the number of licenses required for each object type either. It's kind of up to the end user to go through and count those out. So there's that piece of it as well. So I wanted to show the couple different options as far as if you were going to go through to do a license assessment, what are your options for this, right? So the first one is going to be more manual, right? What are our manual options here? And the first is we need to determine the user access to the entry points, right? That's first and foremost when we're going in and looking at doing this from a manual perspective. So you'd have to get all the roles users assigned and then look at the menu items for those roles that the user is assigned and look to see the license that's required for those. You then have to determine the highest level license required based on that access, right? And if it's operations level license, then you need to go to the licensing service plans privilege table to determine if the privileges assigned to that user would require a particular license. And then you can, there's a couple different Excel files I have in here. One is that I went in and actually listed out the licenses requirements for each out of the box role, duty, and privilege in object in the system. So that's the first one. That's the first option here. And then the second one is if you are still an AX2012 user that is moving to F&O and you want to compare the out-of-the-box licenses from AX2012 and compare them to what F&O has or would be required to have, the second Excel file here actually shows that as well. So these are available. They're embedded in the links of these are embedded in the PowerPoint that I'm delivering today. So you can absolutely use those. And these are both free resources. They're just available as part of this. So I wanted to do just a quick demo. Let's see if I can change this, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to reshare. All right. So I had, I want to show two different scenarios, and I went before the session today, and I found two different scenarios where a role was assigned very few accesses that would require an operations level license. And so I wanted to show how you could, if you ran across this, right, what you could actually do or how you would actually identify those. So the first one I wanted to show was the tax engine functional consultant. So we go to the view permissions report for this, and I scroll over here. You're going to notice that there are only a couple accesses here, right, that are requiring anything that's listed as finance. here, right? So there's 1, 2, 3 accesses from finance perspective, one from an operations perspective, right? That this particular role has access to. Now, maybe it needs those 4, right? But maybe we could go in and try to see, are there ways that we could potentially, come and review this access and maybe look to see if there are ways to either branch this off and break out this role into a subcategory, or break the operations level licenses off into a separate role from the accesses that don't require that particular license, right? And to make this a little bit more usable in that way, right? So, but again, you can see that you have a number of these accesses are listed as requiring a none license, which is basically a team member license, right? And everything else is requiring a finance or operations level, right? So if we were able to remove these 1, 2, 3, 4 accesses from this role, right, all of a sudden any user assigned to this role only requires a team member license instead of that finance license, right? So we could save ourselves quite a bit of money there. The other role I wanted to show was the hazard. Here we go, hazard materials viewer. So I wanted to show this one because this is actually listed as an operations level license, right? So this means that out of the box, none of the privileges that this role is assigned are tied to the privileges in that licensing service plans privilege table, but the actual objects in this are, and I think there's only one in this role, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so this is another great example. So there's one access in this entire role that's actually requiring an operations level license, right? So this would be a great example to go in and say, does this user actually need this access, or could we maybe clone this role and remove this access and have this user require only a team member license? I think is the only other one in here, right? So I just wanted to show this one because this is only listing an operations license, right? So if you were to assign this role to a user, right, you would have to assign a base license of some kind. It doesn't matter which one in this case, but you'd have to assign a base license. But if you were to remove this access from this role, right, and assign this to a user, that user would only require a team member license then, right? So this would be another example where you could go in and actually maybe reduce the overall cost of ownership of the application by looking to see what you could do for changing security slightly. All right, let me go ahead and reshare this. All right. So this is the manual process that you could do, right? If you want to look at more automated solutions, I'm actually a lead developer on some at FastPaths, so you can reach out after and we can absolutely talk about that as well. So if we're looking at steps to actually save money on licensing, right, there's a couple different options that you can look at. The first is to ensure that your current license assignments match your user requirements based on security, right? You want to make sure that your licenses actually are what they should be for your particular user requirements, and you're not just over provisioning or over assigning a license for a user that doesn't need one, right? That's an easy fix to go in and see. The second one is a little bit tougher, but will give you the best ROI on your security when you're looking at this, right? And this is actually the topic that I use when we're going in, when customers ask, well, why would I even care about getting the licenses correct, or why would I care about setting up my security correctly? And it's really because if you try to go in and implement a least privilege security for your users, right, that's going to give you the best chance, or the best way to actually make sure that, one, you're reducing risk within your organization, but two, making sure that your license costs for the overall application itself are at a minimum, right? And so you can save large chunks of money. We've had a number of customers on the FastPass side that have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars a year, right? Based on using licensing reports and actually going in and taking this least privilege security approach when they are redoing their security or designing their security, right, in the first place. And so going in and actually truly implementing least privilege security around your high risk areas of your system is really where we see a lot of the benefits there. Is one of the best pieces of advice that I can give, because that's going to give you the greatest ROI from both a risk perspective in your organization as well as the licensing costs. And then you can always look for instances like we were looking at there where users or roles are over provisioned, or maybe only have a few accesses that are causing a particular license requirement. And then obviously you can either just remove the offending access, or you can clone that role, make your changes with your correct security. So with that, there are a number of different resources here at the end of the slide deck. All of these are free that I've either generated. A couple of these are from Microsoft. I think the licensing guide is the only one that's from Microsoft directly. Everything else on here is something that I have written either through FastPath or on my educational blog. So you can absolutely check those out. All of those are free resources. And I just had some at the end of this slide deck here. I just had a couple audience questions, and you can answer these if you want to put them in the chat. But these are also just areas that to get your thought process going within your organization, so you can take this back and actually start asking these types of questions, right? So what is your current process for determining user licensing in your organization, right? Do you have a process that you go through and actually look at this on a periodic basis to ensure that your licensing is correct, right? Or have you, is it something that is being put on the wayside and not being done until your renewal is coming up from that side? A couple another big things: do security changes get analyzed for licensing impact before being implemented, right? Because we've went in and shown how security and licensing are tied together. So if you make a change to security, right, you can absolutely impact licensing. In fact, there's a great example, and I don't know if Andre's still on, but Andre and I actually both recognized in an early version of F&O a while back that Microsoft had inadvertently made the system user role require an operations level license, right? So every user that was in the system that was assigned the system user role is now requiring an operations level license. Luckily, we caught that bug before it actually went GA, right? But obviously that is a very useful, or a use case of actually showing where a security change can impact your license requirements, right? And so it's definitely something that you want to make sure you have some sort of process around when you're going in and assigning security. The other part to this is when you're assigning roles to users, right? Is the licensing impact being analyzed there as well, right? It's not just security changes, but user role assignments as well. And then do you perform any licenses and analysis on a periodic basis? Again, like we talked about, right? This isn't a one-time exercise. We should be doing this or have a process in place to do this throughout the life cycle of you owning the application, right? Because we want to make sure that changes to security that we're making or changes to user role assignments aren't impacting licensing in a negative way. And then the bigger one is if you're going from AX 2012 to F&O, or if you have still that upgrade on your project plan, right? How are you going to go about looking at licensing as far as your upgrade path there, right? So these are all just questions, again, to get you kind of thinking about, internally what processes you have, what you can look to do, to maybe kickstart these processes in your organizations and things like that. So with that, I'll go ahead. I can wrap up. I have, again, my contact information is there, link to my blog, my security course podcast, the PowerPoint will be uploaded. If it's not already there, it will be there later today. I can't remember if I uploaded it or not, but it will be at that link there on my website. The QR code on the right will give you all of my details as well. So if there are any questions, I can go ahead and answer those. I haven't seen anything in the chat, but you can absolutely feel free to ask those now, or if not, thank you for attending the session. And if you have any questions later on, you can absolutely feel free to reach out at my email address or Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever you can find me. I don't see any questions, so I can go ahead and hand it back to the Pakistan user group team. But again, thank you for allowing me to speak, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Thank you again for your time today. And Alex, it was really a pleasure. And obviously on a working day, appreciate your help there and guidance to the people on the licensing part.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So we have the, let me just check the next speaker. I think we'll be checking it. Nathan, you're there on the call, right? Yep.
Yep, I'm here.